those of you who may have just missed Monty Python's Flying Circus, here it is again.
I just think the fact that 6 people got together and did what they wanted and really were working purely for the quality of what we were doing.
Our only aim was to be as funny as we could possibly be. It was as simple as that. We just wanted to make people laugh as much as we could force them to.
This is the story of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Though it ran for only 4 series at a variety of times in the early 70s, its influence on TV's comic landscape can't be measured. Imagine an era when dead parrots, cheese shops and nudge nudge wink wink weren't part of the English comedy language.
Know what I mean? Say no more, know what I mean? I beg your pardon?
To understand how it all happened, we have to go back to the early 60s, the height of the satire boom, when Michael Palin and Terry Jones met at Oxford University, and John Cleese and Graham Chapman had become friends in the Cambridge Footlights.
You know, we were starting from scratch. I hadn't the slightest idea when I was at Cambridge that I would go into this business because there was no tradition of that happening in those days. You know, I thought I'd become a lawyer. So when I started out, I was incredibly naive.
Avoiding getting a proper job led John and Graham to the States in 1965 with the Footlights Cambridge Circus. In New York, John met Terry Gilliam, an editor on Help magazine.
We used to do what we called fumetti, which were like comic strips only with real people, with actors.
You have a photo shoot in which you play a character and there's a story, but the dialogue is all done in those speech balloons.
It was about a man who fell in love with his daughter's Barbie doll, and I believe consummated the relationship. And so we became friends at that point.
When I went back to England, he had my number and he contacted me when he got to London, and I think I was instrumental in introducing him to some of the other guys.
He's a real nowhere man.
At Oxford, Michael Palin's comic flair led to an invitation to join one of the university's Edinburgh Festival shows, along with Terry Jones, where the two were spotted by David Frost on a talent scouting mission. Michael Palin also picked up a presenting gig on the ITV pop show Now.
The great thing about Now was that it paid me a lot of money. It was £35 for one day's work, and £35 then were a lot of money. And that enabled me to actually write scripts with Terry for the Frost Report, which paid absolute peanuts.
Palin and his new writing partner Terry Jones found themselves in good company competing for peanuts on the Frost Report. Helping to pop witticisms into the star's ever-welcoming mouth were such wags as Marty Feldman, Barry Cryer and Eric Idle, not to mention Graham Chapman and John Cleese.
If I had to kind of date a moment when it began to come together, I would probably say it was 1966, March, when we all sat down in a room somewhere in the Baker Street area to talk about writing the Frost Report.
The Frost Report was a weekly satirical look at the state of the nation, a bit like Panorama, only with John Cleese and the two Ronnies in place of Richard Dimbleby. Eric Idle was the latest addition to the stable of writers.
Frosty came up and said, I'll give you 10 guineas a minute. And that was like the big time for me. You know, I was 23. I was writing the Frost Report, which was like the biggest show on British television at the time. And John was, of course, in it.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Very interesting.
What? What's interesting? What?
Nothing to worry about. So you think, yeah. Tell me,
I'd heard about this rather legendary character called John Cleese. And then on the Frost Report, I met John for the first time. You know, he was a pretty sort of awesome figure, really, in a way. Very tall and very sort of seemed very confident and strode around much more slowly than everybody else. So it gave the effect of us scurrying along behind this man who had his great long loping strides.
At last, the 1948 show!
The Frost Report would be a breeding ground for all manner of exotic new TV comedy, like At Last, the 1948 show, where Cleese and Chapman performed with Marty Feldman, future goodie Tim Brooke-Taylor, and the lovely Amy MacDonald.
Do what, darling?
Get into the cake!
Oh.
And when Graham and Tim and I and Marty got together for the 1948 show, we were already doing something that was less conventional. than the Frost Report. It was already a little bit stranger and a little bit weirder, and we weren't ending sketches in such a conventional way. So we were beginning to move on.
House? Well, when I said house, I mean 'twere only hole in ground covered by a couple of foot of torn canvas. But it were house to us. Oh, well, we were evicted from our hole in the ground. We had to go and live in the lake.
And then when Mike and Terry and the others started doing Do Not Adjust Your Set, then they were doing more of that kind of stuff, and we were moving into what I call wilder comedy.
Do Not Adjust Your Set's creator, Humphrey Barclay, who had also produced Cambridge Circus, recruited Eric Idle, who brought along Michael Palin and Terry Jones. The choice of musicians was pretty wild too, considering this was a children's show, and the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, fronted by Neil Innes and Viv Stanshall, proved oddly inspirational.
You're wanted in the Twilight Zone now, sir.
Thank you, Rigor.
She's broken all the super hearts of the super.
We were very Hamish Footlighty. We did smart sketches, tight, funny, witty things, but they were more louche in a rock and roll way. And I think they had a tremendous influence on us subconsciously. And when Terry Gilliam came along and joined Do Not Adjust Your Set, he was sent along by John Cleese.
After hitchhiking around Europe, Terry Gilliam made use of the contact numbers John Cleese had given him. Arriving in London, he demonstrated his unique visual and graphic skills to producer Humphrey Barclay, who used him on Do Not Adjust Your Set. The brash American wasn't universally welcomed by the young gentleman.
Even though Mike and Terry felt I was sort of invading their territory, Eric, I think, was fascinated by my sheepskin coat.
I immediately liked the Afghan coat. And he had a very cute girlfriend. So I said, you should let us, I don't know why, I just thought he should join us.
So with Terry Gilliam providing offbeat animations for Do Not Adjust Your Set, a proto-Python gang of four found a home at tea time on ITV. After At Last the 1948 show, Cleese and Chapman moved on to It's Marty, then helped the Future Goodies with Broaden Your Mind. Cleese then invited Palin to join him on How to Irritate People. But it was after seeing Palin and Jones's next collaboration that Cleese got back in touch.
My name is Thomas, and I make wheels. And I'm therefore known as Thomas, the wheelwright.
John rang me up and said, I've seen your complete and utter history of Britain, and, well, you obviously won't be doing any more of those. He said, but, why don't we try and do something together?
Well, Cleese was the great whore, he'd go around with everybody, but he was also the big attractor.
The BBC certainly found Cleese attractive and wanted to keep him on their books. Palin was keen to work with him too, but was waiting for the word from ITV to start on a new show with the Do Not Adjust set. But the word was that they couldn't start for 18 months, so when Cleese called again, TV history was in the making.
It was really a collapsing of the 1948 show and Do Not Adjust Your Set into one show. And the BBC said, well, we can do it right away. And so we said, well, we'll do this one first, and then we'll go and do our one for ITV. And of course, we never got to do that one.
So by 1969, the Gang of Six were all here, agreed on one manifesto to make everyone, especially themselves, laugh as much as possible. But where were they going to go looking for the laughs?
I think we knew that we did not want to do political contemporary satire.
We were the first generation of the children of television. And so naturally you see the way we look at things is always through the eyes of television.
We'd sort of been encouraged by, of course, the great eminence grise of Python, which was Spike Milligan. And Spike had done a series called Q5 just before, I think 1968, early 69. And we loved the free form of that.
Good evening. And beep-bom, bom-bom-bom. Puzzled? Let me explain.
Because not only were we the first children of television, but our childhood was radio. So that gave us all this surreal images of the radio comedies, which were so great, which allowed, the mind to go off in all sorts of different weird directions. And I think you can trace that through Python too.
And they're off!
Practically, we poached Spike's producer, Ian McNaughton. And, in terms of inspiration, we looked to a show which would be a kind of stream of consciousness. I remember this was discussed very early on.